Thank you so much for joining us today, Megan. I really appreciate your time. I know that you're busy. Just to give some background to everyone, Meagan Jabbori is our top instructor, top tutor here. She's our lead course instructor and tutor. She's been working with me for a while now, and we actually started our appeals firm, the Heidemann Jabbori Law Firm, together. So I'm going to let her give some background on that. But thanks so much for joining us, Megan.
Oh, thank you for having me. Of course.
All right, perfect. So, Megan, I obviously know your background, but could you please explain to everybody who you are and kind of like the background of our firm, just so people know?
Yes, yes. So I went to Wayne State University Law School. I'm a licensed attorney here in Michigan. And in terms of our firm and what we do, we specialize in writing Michigan bar exam appeals. So Michigan's one of the few jurisdictions that allow examinees who are unsuccessful on the bar to appeal their score, essentially argue that they were underscored and hopefully as a result can pass the bar exam without actually retaking the examination. So that's what it means to have a bar exam appeal, and that's what we specialize in writing here at our firm.
Perfect. And how successful are appeals in general in the state and the law firm itself?
Great question. So not many appeals pass in the state of Michigan each administration. So to be clear, this is not something that we see a lot of. In terms of our success rates, we have absolute great success. So, for instance, for the February 2020 bar exam administration, the Board of Law Examiners passed 7 in the state of Michigan, and we wrote 5 of those. For the administration prior to that, we wrote 9 bar exam appeals in total, and 7 of our 9 passed. For the administration before that, 9 appeals passed in the state. We wrote 8 of those. And then finally, the administration prior, we wrote 100% of the passing appeals in the state. So obviously, that's not all of our statistics going back to when we first started doing this, but that's just kind of a preview. So there's not many that pass each year, and we do a pretty good job at making sure most of ours do.
Perfect. Thank you. And what is a Michigan bar exam appeal? How close do you actually have to be to passing to realistically appeal your score?
Great question. And this is something people ask us every single administration, just because there's not a ton of information out there about bar exam appeals. So an appeal is where you take your essay exam answers and the scored version of them, and we essentially argue that the score you received was not sufficient and that you should have received more, and we have to give them a good reason for that claim. And you have to be pretty close to appeal. And that's because, as I just mentioned, not many bar exam appeals pass each administration. And those that usually do pass only need a few points. So the appeals that we tend to take on are somewhere between 1 and 5 points max. So again, you have to get pretty close initially to be a good candidate to appeal.
If someone's not necessarily in the appealable range, but they have a compelling personal story about why they want to be an attorney or something like that, is it worth it to appeal for that reason or to include that in a bar exam appeal?
Great question. So we know everyone comes to the table with their own unique circumstances, and no one wants to retake the bar examination. But truly, a good bar exam appeal that has a shot at being successful should be limited to what they actually wrote in response to the question. And in fact, the board is pretty clear in their instructions that they don't want any sort of identifying information. So we, in fact, have to be very careful about the type of information we include in an appeal. So I would say no. If you're thinking about appealing and you want to know whether or not you're a good candidate, we truly limit oftentimes our recommendation to, of course, your scores, how close you are to that passing number, and what you wrote for your essays.
Perfect. Good to know. Do most states allow bar exam appeals?
No, actually the opposite. So most states do not. Some states have like regrading processes. If you're close or within a certain point range to whatever is their passing score, they have again like a regrade process, but it's not like Michigan's process where you would, hire an attorney like us, for instance, or write your own appeal. So I guess I would summarize that to say no.
What advice do you have for people taking the bar exam based on the thousands of essays that you've read and that you review every administration?
So I think the most helpful piece of advice I can give is the best way to prepare for the bar is not to necessarily obsess about every single testable detail and every testable subject on the bar. Because, in fact, I don't think you could know all of that information, and that prep is not the most efficient way to maximize your chances of being successful. So I think the most helpful tip I could give someone preparing for the bar is that when they review every subject, they should make sure they're reviewing those highly tested areas of law. They should make sure they're practicing old questions, because the examiners like to retest things in similar fashions. So by practicing past questions, you're really, really preparing yourself. And then another tip I have is, it sounds kind of silly and straightforward, but it's so necessary to actually answer the question being asked. So if that means you need to reread the question multiple times to make sure that you're answering it, then do it, because they can't give you points for something that they're not asking. And then I would have to say, finally, err on the side of writing more. Because if you find yourself in a position to need to appeal, we can't appeal if we don't have an answer or something to write in response.
Perfect. What do you recommend doing and not recommend doing if an examinee does not know an answer to the question? Like, let's say somebody gets to a question, they say, I have absolutely no idea what to say, and I want to get the maximum amount of points possible, obviously.
The best approach to that situation is to write, and to write with confidence. So, if you can identify the subject being tested, which I think for the most part people can, even if they can't necessarily articulate the precise issue being tested, that's okay. Write with confidence, give background information, because again, they can't give you points for something you don't write down. And if it's a challenging question, my guess is the average examinee is struggling with it as well. So the more you write, the better.
Perfect. What advice would you give to an examinee who runs out of time on the exam? And is this something that you see pretty regularly?
So I think the best advice, first and foremost, is giving you help on the front end to avoid this situation. And the best way to avoid this situation is to practice timed questions in preparation for the bar, so that you're putting yourself in these circumstances under those timed constraints. Now, if you find yourself on bar exam day, looking at that clock, knowing that you're not going to finish writing what you need to write down, you should try your very best to get down a rule and a conclusion. Don't beg for points. Don't try to curry favor with the graders. Truly, you need to write down something they can give you points for, like a rule or like a conclusion. Conclusions get you points on the Michigan bar exam. So that's probably, if you can only write one thing, try that.
Perfect. What are some of the biggest mistakes that you see, and how can examinees maximize their chances of not making these mistakes?
So I would say one of the biggest mistakes we regularly see is a student not answering a question, or an examinee not actually answering a question. And maybe that's because they run out of time. And obviously we just kind of addressed that briefly. But it truly is sometimes where people think they're answering the question and they kind of get off on a tangent. So truly get in the habit of reading the question and reading it again, and see if that helps keep you focused. Because again, they can only give you points based upon what the question is being posed. So you really want to make sure you're answering that. And assuming that you're not running out of time, I also oftentimes recommend that people beef up their analysis. So go back up to that fact pattern and try to incorporate even just a sentence or two of another fact to again kind of beef up that analysis and to give the grader more. That's a great way to get your essay response to stand out.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That's great advice. I really appreciate your time.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.